this theme is really kind of an interesting one, and certainly thanks to Free Range for hosting us, thanks to Creative Mornings for suggesting it. I don't really typically do a lot of these types of talks, and so I've been spending the last week really kind of reflecting and thinking about survival. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of two kinds of survival, and one is just really the concept itself, and the second one is really how do we survive as creative people, whether we identify by that particular label because we're a designer or a theater performer or whatnot. My family is actually a family of survivors. My grandmother walked, I think, somewhere between 300 and 400 miles in Eastern Europe to get to the Mediterranean to take a boat to Israel. She was a Romanian Jew. And there's some tales from there that I know of that I won't share today, but I've certainly heard some things about that experience. And then they lived in Israel for a while, and they actually immigrated to the US. And so my mom, was an immigrant at age 6 and moved to New York City to live in the South Bronx. Still predominantly, I think, Puerto Rican. At that time, it was almost completely Puerto Rican neighborhood. So you can imagine that a little 6-year-old Jewish white girl sort of stuck out a little bit. And so there's some tales about survival there too that are really intense. And my family grew up, because my dad's side of the family is Italian, and they were also immigrants. We grew up kind of with survival, like right there in your face and in front of you all the time. And so, I think until about age maybe 15 or 16, my family of 5 lived below the poverty line by quite a lot. And so, paying the rent, paying the gas bill, buying food was this kind of monumental task every month. And I'd like to say that I sort of rocketed my way into not having to deal with that, but that's not true. I kind of repeated some of that cycle myself. And somewhere sort of in the middle of my life, between 23 and I'm now 33, I had this experience where my mom contracted ovarian cancer, and so we spent about 4.5 years going through that whole process. Anybody has a family member, a friend that's been through it, you've got rounds of chemo and radiation, you've got so many more doctor's trips than you can imagine, and lots of the times you've got things that there's not much you can do, right, except for survive. You just find a way to get through it. It's really emotionally kind of an intense process. And so in 2011, my mom passed away from ovarian cancer after, kind of all of those kinds of things in process. And I actually also ended a marriage. I ended up in divorce and bankruptcy, and if I'm being honest with you, I ended up in emotional bankruptcy at that particular time too. I was just kind of just everything happened and kind of came to a head in 1 year. And so I think, without really elongating that point too much, I think when you talk about really baseline survival, you're talking about what it's like to just go through this sort of churning experience. And this is the worst part about survival, is that it gets really monotonous, right? And if, I have friends that are sort of across the spectrum of life, economically, racially, religiously, all sorts of social beliefs and whatnot. And when you're really down there in that sort of deep survival mode, it just gets monotonous and sort of terrible, right? And so I bring all that up because I think it's really important when we talk about what creatives do to survive and what we do to grow and sort of help other people. It's really important to know that that's the baseline. So, and of course, we're in a political time, no matter what your political persuasions are, where survival is really, really on the line for a lot of people. Immigrants are certainly one of those groups, refugees, people who are in transition, homeless folks, families that are living there at that bottom level. So it's something I think about a lot. So in the 6 years since I, sort of had that emotional and financial bankruptcy at that moment, in 2011, I put a lot of work into thinking about how do I as a person support not just myself but other creative people and sort of grow what I can grow in the world, sort of pick a piece of real estate that I can help with, right, in some fashion. And so I wanted to just kind of share 3 things that I think about a lot and that I've thought about a lot over the last 6 years and that maybe will be useful, maybe not. It's hard to say. So perfect, Julie, if you want to pop it up. I just have a couple of examples that I think will kind of help a little bit to illustrate it. So the first sort of piece is actually about value. It's about creative value and networks. So this is actually a piece that I was a project manager for. I worked for a startup in San Francisco. And this particular piece, we worked with NBC News to pull down a ton of data from one of their kind of think tank partners. And I haven't actually dug into this. It's probably pretty interesting now because that was 2013. So this might have changed a little politically, right? But this was a piece where we were trying to help people kind of understand, what is this silent majority that we always hear about politically? And the total number of data points on this piece, oh my God, the spreadsheet is awful. I can't even tell you. Probably like 8,000 to 12,000 pieces of data, in this one interactive web page. And the goal was to help people understand sort of the spectrum. So when we talk about networks, we often think about it, and certainly our programming world, right, the digital world is sort of set up like this. We often think about networks as nodes, right? And you've all sort of seen some variation on that, whether it's like a chart or graph or whatnot. And the node looks something like, sorry, I'm gonna use a couple of these cups. The node looks something like this. There's this point, and then there's this point over here. And, bless you. And we say, okay, there's value right here. This is a person, this is a data point, this is where the value is. And then we say if we could just connect that to this other person or this other node or data point or person. But the reality is that almost the entire amount of the value is actually like right here. It's in the middle. And we do such a terrible job of understanding that. So when I think about creative value and I think about what networks actually are about, I'm looking for that stuff in the middle. And that's something that I think a lot of people miss. You can introduce these sort of two data points or people or whatever it is, and you can put them together. And you may think that you have the value, but a lot of times you have to really examine what's in the middle. It's really important. And that ground is not easy, right? There's feelings, there's ideas, there's concepts, there's things that maybe aren't even explored yet. So it's tricky. But if you can orient yourself to think about it that way, you will likely find a lot of the value that's in between these kinds of groups. And I love these sort of taglines, MBA middle, gospel left, bleeding hearts. It's sort of funny political language. But how do you get like these people to talk to these people? Well, there's some value in the middle that's probably not really being understood. And by the way, that also, it's harder, but that also deals with the real problem of like the fact that like me and one other person are probably not going to agree on everything, but we want to find some kind of ground to work on something, right, as creative people in any fashion. And look, I might think that you're a complete piece of what on one thing, but on another thing, maybe we have room to work on it. And if we don't think about what the value is between people and we just go, you're this node, I'm that node, we're going to continue to do the same kinds of things we've always done, which are terrible and awful. And that's something to really watch for. So that's kind of the first piece. You can flip to the next one, Julia. So really thinking about creative value and what is that space between is not a small thing. And it's also it's a lot of work. Another thing that I've thought a lot about for the last 6 years is it's about constraints. And so designers, illustrators, theater performers, artists that are in the room will sort of immediately recognize the sort of question of constraints. You can't create something that's, all-encompassing, even though as a creative person I want to create something that reaches every single person ever. It's tempting. And I think there's probably some startup people next door with the same kind of problem. Who's your customer? Who's your audience? This is actually a rock and roll show at a house I used to live at. I used to throw shows. I still do. And so these two guys are in a band. And this is a really lovely photo by Rocky Norton. I know some people in this room know Rocky. He's a really talented local photographer, skateboarder, furniture maker. And he just has this eye for capturing like great rock and roll like moments. And this is my living room from sort of like 2012 or 2013. People are doing this in my living room, so it's a little intense. But you get to see this sort of unbridled, like real love of rock and roll. And I played some sweaty, dirty rock and roll shows that are just like as chaotic as this and then some. Good constraints are about helping people get to a moment of inspiration or motivation, or simply just to do the best thing they could possibly do, right? And I have no judgment on that. I think everybody kind of comes to it in different ways. But if you can contain something in a way that makes sense, that enables people, that has the right set of constraints, that helps people do something that's meaningful to them, that's the look you're going to get on their face. And that is the kind of art and music and theater and online platforms and technology that you want to build. You know, every single person I know wants to build that kind of moment, you know, and that's why you have, if you run a company, you have a customer service team, so you can make sure that people can have that moment sometimes. So, and then the last thing I just want to, there's no accompanying visual for this one, but perhaps we can leave this one up and it's sort of perfect, is over the last 6 years, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to repurpose everything. So there's a couple journalists in here, they know this problem really well. And artists certainly know this problem too, because you can't just sort of paint a canvas and that's all you do. Now you got to figure out all these different ways to get it out to people, whether it's prints or whatnot. Journalists deal with, you know, video versus photo, writing, data presentation like we saw. And if you can figure out how to repurpose things, not only do you learn a lot more about what you really want to work on, but you get to reach a lot more people. And so if you're a writer and you can figure out how to take great photos or just like work with an amazing photographer, your work gets more resonance. It becomes like more interesting and it becomes more engaging and compelling. And so, you know, I've been a journalist and, you know, have hand-coded websites and, you know, managed these crazy sorts of interactive projects and stuff like that. I'm also a musician and a writer myself. And I've learned that if you can understand those moments of like real beauty and real sort of compelling, meaningful interaction between people in the universe, and you can find a way to like communicate that across different channels, that's tremendously powerful. And you know, I'll leave this talk with just one last little bit, right, as an example. You know, people who know me know that I'm like a real pain in the ass about grammar and, you know, editing, and like I just, you know, I'll edit that photo 10 times to get it right. Like this photo, I spent 35 minutes looking through about, I want to say 300 of Rocky's photos to find this one, because I wanted you all to have this experience, to get a sense of like, this is a little peek at what happens between four walls when people feel really like they feel the spirit of rock and roll, right? And so taking that time to really, when you repurpose things, think about like how people are going to receive it in that different manner, whether it's, you know, music, whether it's like one social media channel versus another. That's no small thing. It's really, really important to sort of have your head wrapped around that. So having said that, I think that sort of wraps it up. I'm really excited for Sydney, who's up next, and thanks for your time and attention.